Damage types are some of the most fun aspects to experiment with in-game and gives rise to plenty of unique builds and role-playing opportunities. So today I want to take a closer look at how good the various damage types are and answer the question, what are the good damage types in Outward? To break this down, we should consider a chunk at a time. The main components that influence how good a particular damage type is are the following: the defense of the enemy, various damage bonuses, and the weapon. So let us start with the defense. The game reduces incoming damage by two methods. The first one is protection, which lowers the damage by a flat amount. This stat is significantly rarer than the second method, which is resistance. Resistance is a percentage reduction in damage, and you can find that on pretty much every enemy. So, to get an understanding of what damage type is the best, then we should actually be taking a closer look at the resistances of all the enemies. Getting the resistance data by itself is no hassle. The wiki has that data readily available. But if we have lots of enemies, how do we describe the resistance in terms of a single value? We can't just list the entire dataset, that's super hard to digest. This is where some basic statistics can help us. To get an understanding of large datasets, we use tools like averages. But is taking the average of the resistances even accurate? Would such a number accurately represent how tough enemies are? Well, not exactly. Toughness isn't a simple value like resistances, but more akin to how many hits do you need to kill an enemy. So, here's the equation for how many hits we need to kill an enemy. What we see is that the term scales by 1 divided by 1 minus resistance. So, when we evaluate how much resistances contribute, they should scale according to this factor and also by the HP. So this is my optimal methodology for finding the resistance. We calculate the hit factor for every enemy. Instead of a resistance, they get this hit factor, which should more accurately describe how tough an enemy is against a damage type. Then we do the averaging, but we use weighted averages, where the weights are the HP. Once we have the average hit factor, in other words the toughness, then we can convert it back to a resistance that should accurately describe how tough the average fight is. Let's consider a simple example. We have two enemies with 100 HP. One of them has 75% resistance and the other one has 0% resistance. If we defeat them with a weapon that deals 20 damage, then in a real fight, we would require 25 hits to kill them both. 20 for the first one, 5 for the other one. Now, if we use our model, then we would calculate a resistance of 60% for those enemies. And using 60% resistance as a substitute in that fight, we would find that we would also deal 25 hits to finish them both. On the other hand, if we were to use average resistances, then we would get a value of 37.5%, which would mean that we need 16 hits to defeat them. So our model is way more accurate. Now that we got a gut feeling for the model, let's look towards applying this data to a bigger dataset. Before we jump into the results, we should address some things first with the data handling. Some enemies are unfortunately immune, so our hit factor becomes infinite. This makes sense, but it makes our data not very interesting to interpret. So we will make a shortcut around this issue by reconstructing this from hexed values. We simply take the hexed value and add 25% to the resistance stat. You may think of this as a lower limit. Anyway, I will mark whenever I make this simplification and add it to the chart. Another thing I want to mention is that not all of the data is something I would value the same. So something like unknown arena bosses will be in a separate category from everything else. Here is the resistance of the unknown arena bosses. I performed the calculation for enemies with no debuffs, only hexes which includes pain, and also one where the enemies are fully debuffed with both hexes and elemental vulnerability. The lower resistance, the better of course. We can see that the physical has a decently high resistance, with elemental resistance being significantly lower. Additionally, as more debuffs are added, physical damage falls further behind. Another funny thing we see is that when the enemies are fully debuffed, then Lightning manages to outcompete Ethereal and grab the title for the best. DK is another one that's comforting to see, as that usually gets shafted against regular enemies. Anyway, as promised, here's the elements that we have simplified using the hex reconstruction. As you might expect, this is caused by the Plague Doctor, Lightmender and the Elite Burning Man with his trusty steeds. So, if you were to run a mono build against the bosses, be sure to include hexes or elemental vulnerability for those fights, or you will get stuck. Same trends hold for regular enemies, but we see two main differences. Ethereal struggles significantly more, giving Lightning an even clearer lead. And the second difference is decay and fire swapping places due to lots of regular enemies resisting decay. Here's also damage types that have immune enemies. So if you run a mono build with these, remember to bring either a hex or elemental vulnerability to the fight. Now we combine the two plots from earlier with a ratio of 30% unknown arena and 70% regular. It doesn't change too much, and that's partly why I think it makes for a good summary of the game as a whole. Here we have it marked as well for the categories that are affected by the hex reconstruction, or in other words they have immune enemies that we had to fix or patch in. For an optimal build that inflicts all the hexes and elemental vulnerability, we can simplify this chart on the right even further. We can form a damage type multiplier that represents how much of a particular damage type tends to do. Just effectively 1 minus the resistance value we found on the last slide. Remember, this is for fully debuffed enemies. With those disclaimers out of the way, here's the awesome chart. We can quickly calculate how much leverage our type has. This majorly speeds up how quickly we can calculate the effective damage output of various weapons. Let's do a quick comparison between the Masterpiece Claymore and the Great Runic Blade. Using this chart, we can say that although the Masterpiece Claymore deals 57 physical damage, that damage will on average be multiplied by 0.75, so the average damage output will be 41.75 damage. Similarly, for the Great Runic Blade, when fully debuffing the enemy, 39 ethereal damage ends up becoming 55.38 damage. We can also do weapons with split scaling in different types and calculate it for each type separately. So, I wish to humbly congratulate Lightning for the best damage type in the game. Raw, not technically the worst, it gets the shortest stick in regards to damage bonuses, which we will get back to briefly. So enjoy your place above physical for the time being. Now we gotta fix our eyes on damage bonuses. What are the winners and losers of that category? Damage bonuses are tricky to cover because there's a lot of variation caused by external factors. Let us get into why. We had it simple with damage types because it only competes with other damage types. Meanwhile, for damage bonuses it competes with other stats such as resistances, stamina cost reduction, and the list goes on. So our chart for one person will be completely different to another person because of the preferences and build type. This means that to get anything meaningful we will have to put up some restrictions and simplification. My restriction is that I will only compare maximum damage bonuses. Additionally, I have these restrictions. Also, we don't multiply by the damage bonuses directly in our damage equation. We multiply by 1 plus damage bonus, so our chart should also include this. This offset is important to getting a true value of the relative strength. The resulting chart shows the strength of the damage types based on their damage bonuses. As I said, we rank them based on the damage bonus multiplier, as that will give a more accurate gauge of their true strength. There are 4 main observations I want to make. 1. We see that Raw falls very far behind. The second is that both Physical and Lightning are great for casual players, as a lot of the bonuses come from passives and equipment. Status effects are typically more of a hassle to deal with. The third point is that spread between the lowest and the highest elemental damage type is about the same as what we saw earlier with the damage type multiplier, which was related to the defense. This means that when we stack these two together, because that they multiply, some of them might line up and we might get a huge overall boost. The fourth point is that DK has a lot of damage coming from the status effect related to Defiled, which gives 0.5 just by itself. So I could also rank up there with Physical and Lightning for casual players, but at the same time you get a lot of drawbacks making it less comfortable for a lazy build. Even though it's quite even, still DK and Fire does hit the top of the chart. Now I want to just summarize that the HP loss now can be simplified as the base damage multiplied by the damage bonus multiplier, multiplied again by the damage type multiplier. So DBM comes from the damage bonus and DTM comes from the resistances. If you combine these two findings, we multiply DBM and DTM together, we get this total multiplier chart. If you want to run optimized mono build with full glass cannon, this is the multiplier for the various damage types. What we see is that Lightning pulls a good lead due to the scoring the best in the first round when we evaluated defenses, and it also scored decently well in the second round when we evaluated damage bonuses. Because of the final outcome is based on multiplication, it shoots far ahead of the others. Otherwise, the elements are somewhat close, with Frost and Fire being surprisingly neck in neck. A clear step below the elements we can see both Physical, and below that, almost hitting the floor, is Raw. We have so far analyzed defenses and damage bonuses, so the last thing to take a look at is weapons. We will try to apply all the information to some high-end weapons to see how they rank. Some weapons also come with status effect build-up, so I want to just quickly go over the DPS values for various status effects, so that when we look at the weapons we can just add the DPS value from the status effect. I also did some calculations on the bleed damage to see where to slot in. I used the same composition where 30% of it comes from known arena bosses and 70% comes from the rest. I also filter out immune enemies. But for us the main one that we will consider is Blaze, which deals 8 fire damage per second. Here are the endgame weapons representing various damage types. For Frost we have Togebakesit. For Lightning we have the Radiant Wolf Sword. For DK we have the Scepter of the Cruel Priest. For Fire we have Meteoric Knuckles. For Ethereal we have Runic Blade, although we could also have gone with Skeps Blade. However, I wanted another pure elemental weapon for this analysis. For Physical we have two weapons. We have the typical two-handed weapon in Grind and also another gauntlet in Golden Iron Knuckles. All these weapons have imbues added, and for the physical damaging weapons I am using Dark Varnishes because they are more powerful than Wind Imbue. Other than the base damage, we also have how many times per second the weapon hits, as well as any important status effects. Now we convert everything into base DPS. We can now combine this base DPS with damage bonuses and the resistance we will be facing to get the DPS contributed from each element and on every weapon. All mono weapons have fully debuffed enemies. This means that Radiant Wolf, Scepter and Runic Blade use both Hex and Elemental Vulnerability. For Togebakesit and Meteoric Knuckles, they fully debuff against Frost and Fire respectively, so both the Hex and Elemental Vulnerability. For our primarily physical weapons, they only debuff against physical damage by using Pain. For the top 3 we have our 3 Knuckles. Togebakesit at first place with a cool DPS of 537. This is followed by Meteoric Knuckles at 438 and Golden Iron Knuckles at 406. This clearly illustrates that when accounting for imbues, the base attack speed becomes super important, and the adjustments from damage bonuses and the resistances is pretty balanced otherwise, so that all damage types have valid options. So what are the takeaways? Well, for one, Physical and Lightning are both great for lazy builds. Elemental damage is very strong when optimized for. A debuffing strategy is more powerful than multiple elements due to the reduction in resistance being so strong and allowing you to get great value from damage bonuses. We also see that in the end it comes down to the weapon. Weapon reigns supreme and damage type doesn't matter as much. Lastly, we want to say that DOTs are somewhat mediocre for these kinds of builds, but nonetheless they can be respected for their early game importance. I also want to highlight the importance of these charts, which tells the resistance, for various damage types when you are debuffing or when you're not debuffing. So, what are the good damage types in Outward? Well, I would say it is lightning and to a lesser degree ice, but in the end it really comes down to the weapon in question. The weapon matters the most. Thank you for watching. I hope it was both enjoyable, informative and gives you a spark to try a different build. Have a great day.